From Middle East Eye, Iran receives China's surface-to-air missile batteries after Israel's ceasefire deal. The Islamic Republic is trading oil for China's air defense missiles as it looks to rebuild capacities destroyed by Israel. Now, I also want to show you this. So during the BRICS summit, Sergei Lavrov said that Russia is ready to help Iran with its civilian nuclear program, which was heavily damaged in these bombings. Now, Brian, Benjamin Netanyahu is having a really extended stay at the White House. And there's many who are saying, reports are coming out that one of the big reasons for this is that there's coordination and discussion about another attack on Iran. We know that's coming. So talk about the significance of these developments then of Iran looking to China to bolster its defenses, and how you see the coming days here as the discussion that you've had about strategic sequencing, division of labor seem to be bearing much fruit.
Yes, what Carl and KJ are talking about is what is, a lot of people make the mistake of looking at each one of these conflicts in isolation. This is all part of one single geopolitical objective the U.S. has. And again, it is about establishing, maintaining, expanding global primacy. Every single one of these conflicts is linked to the other. The United States is trying to overthrow the government of Iran. It's not about their nuclear program. It is about regime change. It's about regime change everywhere. They want regime change in Iran, in Russia, in China. And at a minimum, they want to contain these countries, but ultimately they want to subordinate them and control them, politically capture them. And so this was not going to ever end with the U.S. just carrying out strikes on Iran's nuclear program. What this was basically the beginning of direct warfare between the U.S. and Iran, and also between the U.S. proxy Israel and Iran. This perceived political limit of striking at Iran directly rather than through proxies or fighting proxy wars elsewhere in the region, that is over. Now it is direct warfare. And yes, this concept of strategic sequencing and division of labor is the manifestation of people in Washington on Wall Street realizing the limits to their power, the rising multipolar world, and the realities that they do not have unlimited military, economic, political, diplomatic power. And they have to conserve it and use it very, very carefully now. They cannot wage a three-front war like Carl was referring to this Palantir head talking about waging a three-front war. It literally is impossible. And it's impossible for all of these reasons we've been discussing. The missiles alone, not just air defense missiles, but offensive capabilities. The U.S. simply does not make enough missiles to wage any one of these wars, let alone all three of them at the same time. They make something like 550 to 600 Patriot missile interceptors every single year. Russia makes over 800 Iskander missiles a year. And you would need about 2, probably more interceptors, Patriot interceptors, to take down one Iskander. And that is happening every single day in Ukraine. And so they don't even have half of the missiles they need just for Ukraine, let alone for waging war against Iran in the Middle East, and certainly not waging a war against China in the Asia Pacific. And so, Danny, you're talking about what is going to happen in Iran. Everybody is reloading. Everybody is preparing. Yeah. There was a lot of talk about, Iran needs Su-35 or Chinese warplanes. That's unrealistic. There's a reason Iran picked air defense and ballistic missiles, because it was the most realistic option they could pick that would be effective against the military capabilities of the U.S. and Israel. You're not going to get 25 or even 50 Chinese or Russian warplanes and fight and overcome 200, 300 U.S. Israeli warplanes. And you have to remember, it's not just how many warplanes you have. Experience, training, infrastructure, intel, all of these things mount in the U.S. and Israelis' favor in terms of air power. So Iran is focusing on their strengths. Their strengths are air defense and ballistic missiles. So it makes perfect sense if China is resupplying Iran with air defense systems. It makes perfect sense. That's what is working, and they need more of that. And if they get more of that, and they get help with their ballistic missiles, this is going to balance things better in their favor. I always warn people not to underestimate the U.S., its capacity to kill and destroy things. People underestimated them in terms of Syria and how overextended both Russia and Iran were in that regards. And Syria is now a proxy. And Carl said the U.S. cannot invade Iran on the ground. Probably not. But they have HTS, who is now being delisted under the Trump administration. Literally, Al-Qaeda in Syria is being delisted. And why do you think that is? So that the U.S. can openly arm and back them in a proxy war against either Iran directly or its allies in the region.
Carl, I know you've been covering Iran's seemingly pivot. I don't call it a pivot to China just because China was already supplying air defenses in the past. But it appears from recent reports that Iran is really, as Brian said, looking to regroup and rearm, and China is its primary source. Now, China has not necessarily verified these reports. They just said that their foreign ministry spokesperson said they're willing to give military equipment to friendly countries. Iran is a friendly country. So your analysis.
Yeah, I mean that's I think that we can take that as a confirmation. And I agree with Brian. It actually makes perfect sense for Iran to get air defense system first, because what we saw in that 12-day war is that Iran's missiles were causing major havoc in Israel. This is for the first time Tel Aviv and Haifa was getting hit. For the first time, Israel no longer can push their aggression with impunity. However, Israeli air superiority meant that they were, Israeli F-35s were in air hunting down missile launchers on the western side of Iran. Now, this is obviously not ideal because Iran's capability to inflict hurt on Israel is, major reason why Israel end up suing for ceasefire. So Iran need to make sure their missile launchers are protected. That's where Iran has advantage, because Iran has tens of thousands of missiles. But if they can't, deploy their missile launchers, because of the fear of Israeli aerial attack, that could be a problem. So in terms of air defense, people have to remember the international arms embargo on Iran was only lifted in October 2020, right? And so Iran didn't actually have much time to build up their air defense before the Israeli attack. Now, I know there's talks why Russia haven't delivered S-300 or S-400. But people need to realize right now Russia's priority is Ukraine. That's an existential issue for them. That's what Russia is concentrated on. Whereas China, according to the Western media, China have issue of overcapacity. Right, for China to supply those air defense system, there's no supply bottleneck. As opposed to U.S. supplying missiles to missile interceptor to Israel, as Brian again pointed out. The United States deployed THAAD batteries to protect Israel. Now, those THAAD batteries, radar, launcher, everything together, each one cost $1 billion with a B, and each THAAD missiles cost between 12 to 13 million dollars, and pretty soon it adds up to real money. And the United States planned production for that missile interceptor was 12 for the year of 2025. So guess what? Israel has just fired off more than 1 year supplies of that missiles. They fired off more than 1 year supply of that missiles over Israel in course of 12 days. And there's no way United States will be able to keep up with that to supply Israel. And there's a real resource constraint because China's export control on rare earth minerals. For U.S. missiles F-35, they require the Sumerian cobalt heat resistant magnets that come from China, and China has put on the export control on those both the rare earth itself and also the rare earth magnets since last year. This was a response to U.S. chip sanction against China, and this is why Trump was getting really huff and puff, and then finally in their trade talks at London, at first Geneva and then London, they resolved that China agreed to grant export license of rare earth and rare earth magnets to United States car makers, right? So which means for 6 months, which means right now every companies who want rare earth from China, they have to fill out an application to the Chinese Commerce Ministry and say, please, sir, can I have some rare earth? And once the approval is again pending on their behavior. If China detects that they're directing that supply to, say, U.S. defense industries, guess what? That stuff can be stopped anytime. So and also, for people concerned about that, there's a different. The military grade magnet is completely different from what goes into car production. The F-35 requires a lot more of those rare earth components than what goes into a regular car. And so this is the Chinese export control can be quite crippling to the U.S. military industrial complex. And plus, the U.S. just doesn't have the industrial capacity anymore to keep up with the battlefield depletion in both Ukraine and Israel. And this is why Israel sued for peace. But on the other hand, because the quote-unquote Chinese overcapacity, they have no problem. There's no supply bottleneck for China to supply air defense missiles to Iran. And that will clearly happen because I was a bit skeptical, but when Chinese foreign ministry says we're ready to share our achievement with the friendly countries, I think that's a pretty much a confirmation. And this is actually pretty huge. China, Russia, Iran, they were already in the BRICS together. Iran is a full BRICS member, but now with the exchange with the weapon sales, it's not just simply as exchanging hardware for money. It's actually building of relationships, because what that means now, Iranian operators will have to go to China for training. The Chinese will come to Iran to install and do maintenance, and this is a decade-long relationship building exercise. This is why United States, by the way, love weapon sales, and except US use weapon sale as a leverage to tell countries what to do or what not to do. For example, when US sold F-16s to Pakistan, they made Pakistan sign an end user agreement that those F-16s cannot be used in a war against India, right? Whereas China weapon sale comes with no strings attached. China is not going to tell Iran, oh no, you cannot use this against Israel. No, like, it's yours. Go ahead, have fun. And this brings the alignment of China, Iran, and also Russia much more closer together than even before. I think this is it's a move in the positive direction, and I'm pretty sure that's something that also put United States and Israel on notice. Iran is not alone.
Yeah, and KJ, the timing of these reports are not a coincidence. Iran just experienced a major war of aggression, and now Iran is seeking help to ensure that any future, what will be a war of attrition, Brian laid it out quite clearly. This is not going to be, there's going to be no quick, massive scale wars. The U.S. just can't fight it, but they're going to try to grind Iran down, and it seems Iran is more than willing to get help from anybody it can, especially China and Russia, to ensure its survival. Oh, sorry, you're muted.
This is going to go into attritional warfare. But the thing to remember is, I think, very important lesson from Russia is that the US and the US allies are not good at doing a war of attrition. They like quick blitzkrieg, decapitation strikes. This was the Israeli doctrine of war. And this comes out of, the Yom Kippur War, which later became the US doctrine of war against the Soviet Union, air-land battle. And then now they have a doctrine of war against China, air-sea battle. All of this comes out of Israeli war doctrine from the Yom Kippur War. But primarily it's focused on rapid decapitation, deep strikes inland, very, very aggressive, violent, vicious tactics. And then if that doesn't happen, then we see the result. They try to engage in genocide. But there are a couple of things that I think are important to highlight. First, the relationship between China and Iran has been building over the last several decades. But you have to look at the historical, scope. And if you look at that, you understand that Iran and China have had a long history of very good relations, going back to the Sasanian dynasty, in the 600s, 14 centuries ago, that the Sasanian dynasty took refuge with the Tang dynasty, when they were Islamicized. And if you look, for example, at, 14th century manuscripts like the Court of Kayumars, which, tells the history of Iran, it's an illuminated manuscript. If you look at the pictures, they are Chinese style, landscape paintings. It's very, very Chinese. So you can see that over millennia, there's been a very, very close relationship. And of course, in the current moment, China knows that, both Russia and Iran, and of course, China, they're all targets. And so they have to work together. Certainly, they're going to support one another. China has certainly the industrial strength and the supply chains. And I think the other thing which, is very striking is the US, and in particular, Donald Trump, doesn't seem to understand the concept of a supply chain. He's only worked in real estate. Real estate really doesn't have a supply chain. Land doesn't have a supply chain. And a building or real estate only has a few hundred, a few thousand pieces. But a single jet fighter has 350,000 components, and all of them, a large number of them come from come from China or from other parts in Asia. So I think that in terms of war, the contradiction is that if the US were to wage war against China or against China's allies, then it would very rapidly discover that it is waging war against its own supply chain. And Carl mentioned rare earth elements. Of course, rare earth elements are critical for modern technology. Not the least of it are, magnets. If you heat a magnet, if you want to demagnetize a magnet, you heat it. But we know that rare earth elements, samarium and others, you can create magnets that will tolerate extreme high heat. And so these are critical in weapons components. And they're also critical simply because the entire ecosystem under which we function, which is, electronic, is derived from electromagnetic force, which involves magnets. Magnets are critical to modern technology. So there's a real misunderstanding of the supply chains, of vulnerabilities, of the complexities of war on this hybrid economic supply chain logistical level. And then here's the other piece, which is incredibly, I think, ironic, is that, for example, the United States criticized China for not supplying cotton for their artillery shells, for the gun cotton. But what everybody forgot was that it was the United States that had sanctioned China's Xinjiang cotton and said, you can't sell this anywhere. And having created a global shortage of cotton, then they said, shoot, we don't have cellulose for gun cotton for M50, 155 millimeter shells. And then they started to, complain that China was was withholding gun cotton from them. So once again, this incredible stupidity, short-sightedness, contradictory misunderstanding of what real strategic competition looks like. I think these are the weaknesses of the United States, which doesn't mean that they aren't crazy enough to continue to accelerate to war.
Yeah, and Brian, that's been the point you've been making, that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Iran rearms and is able to once again engage in a war of attrition without being toppled in that moment, right? It doesn't matter if the situation isn't as favorable as the 12-day war showed, that the U.S., Israel, they could kill people, they could bomb nuclear sites, they couldn't topple the government. But you've said that this is going to keep on going regardless, and sometimes there is, I think, an assumption that there's some rationality here, that, okay, well, if it's not really going to work out, if this isn't in the interest of the United States, if it's not going to, if there aren't objectives that are going to be met, then they'll stop. But that's not the case, is it, Brian?
No, it's not, because the entire system the U.S. is based on is one of corporate financier interests. They are propelled not by any specific purpose to serve society, but solely to acquire greater and greater profit, which is why the U.S. industrial base looks the way it does. Everything was outsourced without any thought of national security or any purpose to actually serve the idea of you're making things for people to do things, not just to make money. So the outsourcing was perfect for maximizing profit, but it made little sense in basically all other ways, conceivable ways. And the problem that they have now is, even as they try to expand production, their entire industrial base, and they even put out a report, the National Industrial Strategy, where they were talking about, we have all these private corporations making things, and if there's not a demand signal and there's not a compelling business case, they simply won't make these things in the quantities that we need to wage all of these wars. So you have a system that is inherently compelled to constantly pursue greater power and profit, but the system by design is incapable of manufacturing the weapons and all of the other capabilities required to actually do this. And this is something that happens to empires all throughout history. They overextend themselves, and they're so obsessed with pursuing profit and power, they don't actually invest in the things required to get it. China, on the other hand, and Russia, and actually many other countries around the world, people don't understand this. They are using a combination of tools like free markets, but also a purpose-driven society, purpose-driven industry. I remember President Xi Jinping, when he was talking about the real estate crisis in China, he said houses are meant to be lived in. They're meant to be lived in. They're not supposed to be vehicles for speculation. Try telling that to anybody in the United States. Good luck convincing them or getting any sort of policy regarding that. Now, no, the United States is not going to stop its pursuit of war with Iran, with Russia, with China. As I said before, there is this global conflict. It's a global kind of slow motion World War III war of attrition that is taking place. You can see the limits, some of the limits the US has. You can see some of the limits Russia and China actually have. I'll give an example. People could understand, and Carl mentioned S-300, S-400 systems can't be sent to Iran in huge numbers because Russia is waging war basically against all of NATO in Ukraine. So it's not possible. China also has limits. They have a very compelling deal they can make with all of these nations, partnerships they can make with all these nations. The US literally has no alternative for. So China comes to Thailand, where I'm based, and they say, we can do all of these things for you. We can build high-speed rail. We could do all kinds of trade. We have tourists. We have more tourists coming from China to Thailand than all Western countries combined. But the problem is, even though the U.S. cannot compete in this way, the U.S. competes in other ways by coercing and politically capturing a targeted country. So the media space here in Thailand is heavily controlled and influenced by the U.S. and Thailand does not have the ability to push this out. They tried, say, like an NGO law to stop the NED from interfering, and the U.S. just put more and more pressure on the Thai government until they were forced to abandon it. Things like that prevent nations from fully pivoting towards China. So they're constantly playing this balancing act where they're trying to keep the U.S. from burning their country down, but they also obviously, I mean, the only real sustainable relationship they can have is with a nation like China within multipolarism. So this is the large scale geopolitical landscape all of this is taking place in. It's not just these wars. It is U.S. interference all around the globe. It is coercion and political capture. All of these nations are trying to balance. And even though China makes the most compelling, opportunities, let's just say opportunities, a nation is looking at that, but then they're also looking at the U.S. will kill us. They will kill me. They will sanction me. They will destabilize my society. So even though the U.S. has nothing to offer and much less energy is being put into destabilizing the country, it's a more compelling form of coercion than say, Chinese economic persuasion, positive persuasion versus negative coercion.
Yeah, and this is why for Iran, a lot of people criticize Iran. They say Iran didn't do this, they didn't do that, they're too weak, they're not going strong enough. I think people don't appreciate a lot of times in the collective West that self-determination and sovereignty are just such critical components to just being able to exist and develop independently. And Iran, regardless of whoever's been leader in Iran for the last since 1979, they've been able to achieve that, and that's why they are still standing after what was a significant war of aggression, and that's why they're rearming and regrouping. Now they know it's inevitable, and regardless of whatever minutia of what decisions they make that some people may see as a mistake or not good enough or what have you, the fact of the matter is that Iran would not be standing right now without sovereignty, with the maximum pressure sanctions. If it didn't have China as a partner, if it wasn't willing to do, Brian, what you say many countries are just not able to do. They're not able to be in the Belt and Road, or even if they are in the Belt and Road, they're not able to finish projects. That's one of the biggest issues in the Belt and Road Initiative, is these governments are not prepared to equally invest, and some projects just aren't going to get done. So that's a big issue, but Iran appears to be moving forward, and we're going to have to keep track of the next phase, the next chapter, as Netanyahu gets his room in Washington, D.C. and stays there for however long to coordinate and collaborate around another strike.